Hi, my name is Lorraine Watry and welcome to my studio. I am a watercolor artist and I've worked with watercolor for 26 years now, and I thought I would start a new series of videos where I go over different tips, tricks, and techniques for working with watercolor. And hopefully these short videos will help you in your journey, and if you have a question or a technique that you would like to see, please comment below and I will try to accommodate that in a future video. Hi again. I am going to go over the watercolor properties, and this is not a comprehensive talk about those, but it will give you some information that you can use when you're selecting colors. And also a tip on how I mark my palette for what colors I have in the palette. And so I'm going to start with the property of staining versus non-staining, because I want these to dry before I go back on into them later and try to lift some color. So this is phthalo blue that I'm pulling out, and it is a staining color. And I'm going to just put a rectangle of color on there, and then the next color I'm going to use is cobalt. And staining basically means that it wants to stay on the paper. It's harder to lift, harder to get back to the white of the paper. Don't have a lot of water in that. Get a little more water out. Okay, so I'm going to place the cobalt blue on there, and I will let those two dry, and then later I will show how I lift the color and whether or not we can see the white of the paper when I've lifted. So the next section is, some paints are opaque, some are semi-transparent, and some are transparent. And I need to draw a line. And give that just a few seconds to dry. While that's drying, I'm going to go down to the granulating versus non-granulating. So granulating is something that some people really like granulation in paint, and other people, other artists don't necessarily want the granulation, or they would prefer it to be a smoother passage. So granulation happens when part of the pigment either separates when you apply the paint to your paper, or it might be heavier parts of the pigment that drops to the surface of the paper, and you get these little textural specks that happen. And so this is Green Apatite Genuine, and it is a Daniel Smith pigment. And as this dries, we will see more and more granulation. Depends on your pigment. A lot of the earth pigments, browns and things, are granular. A lot of the blues are granular, and a few of some others. Let's see. So this is transparent pearl orange, and it is not a granular pigment. So I'm going to just paint that on for comparison. And I will bring this a little closer in a little bit so you can see what happens with those guys. I have now on my palette either semi-transparent or transparent pigments, because I like working with those and like the glow of the paper to show through. So I took off any opaque pigments, and this is Indian Red, one of the paints that I have that is an opaque pigment. I don't use it. Maybe at some point in my watercolor journey I will want something like this, but right now I prefer the transparent and semi-transparent colors. So I'm just going to pull some of that out and let that dry. And you can see that black line that I had on the paper sort of disappears under that pigment. And then for a semi-transparent pigment, I will use carmine. So these are all going to be sort of in the red to brown red color scheme. So this is carmine, or carmine, depends on how you want to say it. And then the transparent one I will use is quinacridone rose. So I'll pull that one out. All right, so as these dry, we should be able to tell a little better if we can see the black line that was on the paper and maybe see a difference. So when I'm working with the semi-transparent and transparent, I don't really think about it. I just paint with them, and to me they're so similar that generally they're, for me, kind of interchangeable. So then the next thing that I think about when I'm painting is, do I have a pigment that is one pigment, or does it have several colors in that color? So for instance, let's see. Well, for instance, the quinacridone rose that I had out, it is a single pigment color. And so when I mix it with another color or colors, I can get very vibrant mixes. So there's the rose, and I'm going to pull out alizarin crimson. And alizarin crimson, permanent alizarin crimson, is a 3-pigment paint, and this is, most of my pigments are Daniel Smith pigments that I have on this palette, and there are a few that are Holbein. And so there is a difference in the initial color, but there is also a difference in how they mix with other paints. It is made up of 3 pigments, and then cobalt that I used with it adds another pigment, so because it's a single pigment. So here I'm only mixing 2 pigments, and here I'm mixing 4 pigments. So as you add more pigments into your mix, you can start to have either more neutral colors, and sometimes that is how you end up with a muddy looking mix because of the fact that you've got so many pigments mixed together. Changing my mind now. All right, I'm going to use Peacock, and Peacock has 3 pigments in it, and so I will add that to the Quin Rose, and Peacock is a turquoisey blue. I'll just do 2 more here. Whoops. Quin Rose. Okay. I used all of the Peacock. So here's Peacock with the Quin Rose. Still a nice vibrant color. So now I have 4 pigments in this mix, and it is a little more neutral than what this first mix was with the cobalt. But if I pull out Peacock and I mix it with the alizarin that I have over here, and I'll try to keep it on the bluer side of purple, not too red. Now I've got 6 pigments in this mix. Now that's not to say that this color can't be a very nice color depending on what you're trying to do, but this is a more neutral mix. And so it will be on the grayer side of purple. It will never be as vibrant as maybe a mix is over here. If you're trying to get a more vibrant mix, mixing maybe single pigment colors, 3 to 4 colors together, you can get a nice mix still. But if you start mixing in the 5 to 6 range of colors, that's where you start to get more neutral mixes. Even 4 pigments together, because this is definitely more neutral than what we have over here. Okay, so a couple more things. Light fast rating is done to give the artist an idea of whether or not the colors they're working with are viable and will stay on their painting once they have painted their painting, even in brighter light. And so I have pigments on my palette that are only 1 and 2, the highest ratings for light fast. So 1 would be the excellent rating, 2 would be very good, and a 1 rating means that I believe, if I have this correct, that it's at least 100 years that it would be light fast, and that it would probably last well beyond that. But so when I'm painting with my pigments, I am looking for those, and if it says it's a 3 or a 4, then I don't put them on my palette. There's not really anything I can show you necessarily here. This would be something that if you wanted to do on your own, you could take your pigments and make a line, and I'll just do a couple more here. However many pigments you wanted to test, and you could run it like that, and then maybe some sap green, just for green in here. And you could make a big swatch of colors and then take a piece of tape once they had dried completely and use some tape down the center of them. And I usually either double or triple this so that it's not going to allow any light through. And I actually probably would use duct tape. And you can lay this on there once they're dry and cover that middle section. Or you could cover one side, however you would want to do it, and then put this card in the window for a month and then check it. And then maybe check it again in 2 months. And then just keep watching it and check your paints to see if they fade. So I wanted to go back up to those two. I'm going to dry this right quick and I'll be right back. I have now dried those 2 top boxes, and I am going to just take 2 of my scrubber brushes so that I can show you a little bit of a difference in when you're trying to lift color back off. Now you can use a regular brush if you want to try to lift color. The problem with that can be that sometimes the staining color is going to be very hard to lift this way. I can get some color to come back off because it's not permanent, so watercolor is liftable. And so just by taking some water and going back over it, and you can see I'm pulling off pigment and it's on my towel now, I can get color to lift with a brush. That can be a little hard on your brush. Now if I tried to do that with the cobalt, it will lift a lot quicker and it will go back almost to the white of the paper. Depending on how much I kept messing with it, I could probably get it back to the white of the paper. So when I'm lifting color, I tend to use a small flat brush, and this one has a little bit more give to it. It's Royal brand, and it's a number 4, I believe. And it's just a flat brush, it's synthetic. And I can come in here and scrub just a little bit, and then touch with my towel, and I can get it basically back to the white of the paper on the cobalt. On the phthalo, when I do that with this brush, and I'll try one more time, and I'm pushing pretty good, trying to get some color off, I can't get it back to the white of the paper. And part of that is the fact that I'm using a brush that is not as stiff, and then also because this is a staining color, it's not going to lift as easily. So then the other way I can lift is with a stiffer bristle, and this is a fabric flat, and I have this in one of my other videos. And it's still, and actually it's actually pushing color that I'm kind of pushing around into the fibers, so this actually may be lifted a little better than the stiffer bristle. Now if I go over here and use it on the cobalt, you can see I can lift back pretty good. Now I think I'm also seeing a little bit of color that this bristle is pushing kind of into the paper. There we go. If you keep working with it, usually you can get the color off. So now you can see that this is easier to lift because it's non-staining, but there are situations where you might want to use a staining color because then you know it's not going to lift as easily. Also different color mixes and things, or situations where you want that color. So having a staining color is not a bad thing. It just means that you need to be aware that it may not be easily lifted. So then I wanted to show you the granulation of these two. This one, I think you can see, is covering that dark line a little more than both of these, and there is barely a tiny bit more coverage on the line than this one. So I'm going to lift this up. The granulation of the Green Apatite Genuine which is right here, and the difference between the transparent Parole Orange, which doesn't have any granulation. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is that when you have your colors in your palette, it is a really good idea to label them. And you can label them by just taking a permanent marker and writing on the side of your palette or on the top of your palette the names of the pigments and maybe what brand you're using, because not all brands make their pigments the same. And I decided after a while that taking the color chart for my particular pigments, and I found it online and printed it off, and then just taping that to my palette was a really quick way for me to know what pigments I had and what their properties are. So depending on the brand of your paint, some color charts have more information than others. And so since most of mine are Daniel Smith, that's what most of these charts are. So basically a Series 2 pigment means that it is a little more expensive than a Series 1 pigment, and that's one of the things that's marked on here. This pigment happens to be a Series 3, and then the other things you will notice is that it will say whether or not it's a number 1 in light fastness, or if it's rated or not. It will have the next number is how staining or non-staining it is, and then if it's granular, and then it will say if it's transparent or semi-transparent, and also how many pigments are in the pigment itself. So these all in this area have 1 pigment, and then if I rotate, for instance, green gold has 3 pigments in the mix. And there it is. Okay. So the chart, when you're looking at it, you have to look at the key for each brand of pigment, or I mean each brand of paint. So different brands, Holbein, Sennelier, Winsor and Newton, Daniel Smith, they all have their own chart and ways that they label them. But in general, when you are looking at an opaque pigment, it will have a black circle showing that it's opaque. If it's semi-transparent, it will have a half circle, and so that means it's semi-transparent, and then transparent is an open circle. And so then I would just go through your different brands of paint that you have and look up online whether or not there is a watercolor chart for that brand and see if you can print it off. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Just kind of a quick overview of some information about properties of watercolor pigments, and if you have any thoughts for other videos, please comment below and I will see if I can fit them into a future video schedule. Have a good day. Bye.